We want to dig in on this new deal that Ottawa signed with Beijing.
In less than 90 days, a single policy decision north of the United States border triggered a potential loss of more than $200 billion in American auto sales, placed nearly $1 trillion in dealer inventory and household auto loans at risk, and exposed a structural weakness that Washington has spent decades trying to hide. This is not a story about China flooding the market. This is a story about Canada quietly breaking the economic logic that has protected the United States auto industry for a generation. But the real danger is not what consumers can see in showrooms or price lists. The real danger is buried deep inside the financial and political architecture of the United States economy, where a chain reaction has already begun. Listen carefully until the very end, because today I will reveal a mechanism now quietly unfolding behind closed doors in Washington and on Wall Street. It is a mechanism so severe that it threatens losses measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars, damage to American employment and credit markets on a scale not seen in decades, and a trade reckoning so painful that it has never been publicly discussed in full. What is happening is far more destructive than higher car prices. It is a structural break that could force the United States into a decision it has spent years trying to avoid. Within weeks, internal industry data began showing a collapse in consumer urgency across large sections of the United States. In northern states alone, nearly 4 out of every 10 potential buyers indicated they were willing to delay vehicle purchases for at least 12 to 24 months, waiting for cheaper electric vehicle options tied to Canada's new supply channel. For an industry that survives on rapid turnover, this shift was catastrophic. The United States auto retail system is carrying an estimated $780 billion in vehicle inventory, floor plan financing, and short-term dealer debt. That entire structure assumes steady monthly sales volume. When sales slow, interest costs rise immediately. If national vehicle sales fall by just 10%, more than half of all dealerships enter negative cash flow within a single fiscal year. If sales fall closer to 20%, a level now modeled in internal risk scenarios, the system begins to fracture. The shock does not stop at the dealership level. Auto loans now account for roughly $1.7 trillion in United States household debt. As consumers compare domestic vehicle prices above $40,000 with sub-$25,000 alternatives just across the border, asset values come under pressure. Banks begin tightening credit. Interest rates on new auto loans rise. Monthly payments increase. Demand falls further. This is how feedback loops form. Credit analysts warn that if this trend continues for 2 consecutive years, default rates in subprime and near-prime auto lending could double. Losses to lenders could exceed $90 billion, not from a recession, but from a policy-induced demand collapse. This would not remain isolated. Auto lending feeds directly into consumer credit markets, regional banks, and employment across logistics, servicing, and manufacturing. Meanwhile, Canada is experiencing the inverse effect. Electric vehicle adoption rates are accelerating. Infrastructure investment is expanding. New manufacturing commitments are being announced. Capital is flowing towards stability and predictable access, not tariffs and uncertainty. This is the moment Washington underestimated. Because what looks like a pricing problem is rapidly becoming a liquidity problem, then a credit problem, and finally a political one. And the most dangerous phase has not even begun yet. What happens next involves a clause buried inside North American trade rules that almost no one outside policy circles is talking about, and once it is triggered, there may be no way to reverse it. What is now unfolding is no longer confined to car dealerships or consumer choice. The shock triggered by Canada's decision is moving upward into the core of the United States financial system, where the consequences become exponentially more dangerous. Auto lending in the United States has quietly grown into one of the largest pillars of household credit. Outstanding auto loan balances now exceed $1.7 trillion. Nearly 1/3 of those loans are classified as near-prime or subprime, concentrated among households already under pressure from housing costs, medical expenses, and elevated interest rates. This system depends on one fragile assumption, that vehicle prices remain stable enough to preserve collateral value. Canada has broken that assumption. When vehicles priced below $25,000 become visible and accessible just beyond the border, the perceived value of $40,000 domestic vehicles begins to erode. Credit risk models respond immediately. Lenders tighten approval standards. Loan terms shorten. Monthly payments rise. According to internal stress simulations circulated within the financial sector, even a modest decline in vehicle resale values of 15% could push delinquency rates to levels not seen since the aftermath of the global financial crisis. In a severe scenario now openly discussed among risk officers, a prolonged demand slowdown combined with falling collateral values could generate losses exceeding $100 billion across auto finance, regional banks, and asset-backed securities tied to vehicle loans. These losses would not emerge all at once. They would surface gradually, quarter after quarter, creating the illusion of control until liquidity suddenly vanishes. Employment effects follow quickly. The United States auto ecosystem supports millions of jobs across sales, logistics, financing, servicing, advertising, and manufacturing. Analysts estimate that for every 100,000 vehicles removed from annual sales volume, roughly 25,000 jobs become vulnerable. In a downside scenario where annual vehicle sales decline by 2 million units, job losses could exceed 500,000 within 3 years, concentrated in regions already sensitive to economic stress. Canada, meanwhile, is absorbing the opposite shock. Electric vehicle adoption is accelerating at a pace that infrastructure planners did not expect. Public and private investment in charging networks, battery supply chains, and assembly capacity is expanding rapidly. Capital that once flowed automatically toward the United States is now being rerouted toward regulatory predictability and market access. This is not speculative money. These are long-term industrial commitments measured in decades. Here is the most dangerous implication. Once capital repositions itself, it rarely returns quickly. Supply chains reorganize, talent migrates, political leverage shifts. What Washington is facing is not a temporary trade imbalance, but the early stages of a structural reallocation of power inside North America. And there is one specific mechanism inside the regional trade framework that could accelerate this shift dramatically. It is rarely discussed publicly and almost never explained to voters. If it is activated, the damage to the United States bargaining position could be immediate and irreversible. At this stage, the damage is no longer limited to markets or balance sheets. It is moving into the legal and strategic framework that governs trade across North America, where small technical provisions can trigger consequences measured in generations. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement was designed to lock North American production into an integrated system. Its core promise was stability, predictable access, shared rules. What very few outside trade ministries understand is that this agreement also contains flexibility clauses that quietly allow capital sourcing and value creation to shift toward whichever country offers the most efficient pathway to market access. Canada has positioned itself precisely at that pressure point. By allowing lower-cost electric vehicles to enter under controlled conditions while requiring domestic production, Canada is not violating the agreement. It is exploiting its architecture. Vehicles assembled or substantially transformed inside Canada gain preferential treatment across the region. Components sourced through Canadian facilities begin qualifying for regional content thresholds. Over time, supply chains reclassify themselves without a single headline announcement. This is where Washington faces a severe strategic dilemma. If the United States responds by tightening enforcement, it risks fragmenting the very trade framework it depends on for exports, agriculture, and energy. If it does nothing, production slowly migrates north, protected by rules that the United States itself helped design. Internal trade assessments suggest that within 5 years, this shift could redirect hundreds of billions of dollars in manufacturing output away from American industrial regions, not through relocation headlines, but through quiet accounting changes inside supply chains. The employment consequences are profound. Automotive manufacturing jobs anchor entire regional economies. When assembly volumes fall, secondary industries follow. Steel, plastics, software. Transportation. Local tax bases erode. Social spending rises. Political pressure intensifies. What begins as a trade adjustment ends as a domestic governance crisis. Canada understands this dynamic. That is what makes its strategy so effective and so dangerous to Washington's position. It does not demand concessions. It creates facts on the ground. Once factories are built, once suppliers relocate, once workers retrain, reversal becomes politically and economically impossible. The most alarming signal comes from capital markets. Long-term investors are already recalibrating regional risk. Funds that once viewed the United States as the default industrial anchor now treat it as one option among several. Canada is increasingly seen as the stable intermediary between global production and North American consumption. That perception shift alone carries consequences measured not in years, but in decades. Here is the reality Washington does not want to explain publicly. If this trajectory continues, the United States will face a choice between accepting reduced influence inside its own regional trade system or initiating a confrontation that could unravel it entirely. Neither option is clean, neither option is cheap, and both carry political costs that few administrations are prepared to absorb. And there is still one final element that has not been discussed. A political trigger point tied directly to consumer anger and electoral pressure that could force this decision sooner than anyone expects. As vehicle prices remain elevated and credit tightens, the financial burden shifts directly onto households. Current household auto debt already exceeds $1.7 trillion. Internal consumer stress models suggest that if average monthly vehicle payments continue rising while wages stagnate, as many as 15 million households could be pushed into payment vulnerability within 2 years. That level of strain does not remain invisible. It surfaces in approval ratings, voter turnout, and public anger. The political danger emerges when comparison becomes unavoidable. When American voters see functionally comparable electric vehicles operating just across the northern border at prices tens of thousands of dollars lower, the explanation of national security and job protection loses credibility. Polling data from recent election cycles already shows that cost of living now outranks foreign policy as a voter priority by a wide margin. Transportation costs rank near the top of that list. Once that perception hardens, policy justification collapses. Fiscal pressure compounds the problem. State and local governments rely heavily on auto-related tax revenue, licensing, and employment. If national vehicle sales decline by even 15% for a sustained period, internal budget simulations show revenue shortfalls large enough to force spending cuts or emergency borrowing across multiple states. Social services feel the pressure first. Infrastructure spending follows. Political blame becomes unavoidable. Washington faces a narrowing window. Trade policy reversals are not neutral acts. Removing tariffs under pressure appears weak. Maintaining them as household costs rise appears indifferent. Every month that passes deepens the contradiction. Behind closed doors, policymakers understand this. That is why contingency discussions are already taking place around selective exemptions, quiet renegotiations, and administrative reclassification measures designed to relieve pressure without admitting failure. But here is the most destabilizing projection. In a severe political stress scenario, where consumer anger converges with credit, market strain, and regional job losses, analysts estimate the cumulative economic damage could approach $1.5 trillion over a 5-year horizon. That figure includes lost output, credit write-downs, fiscal stabilization costs, and long-term investment diversion. Once losses reach that scale, Policy becomes reactive rather than strategic. Canada is not driving this countdown. It is simply accelerating it. By offering an alternative pathway to affordability and industrial investment, Canada has forced a comparison the United States cannot easily control. The longer the disparity persists, the louder the political consequences become. What was once a trade dispute risks becoming a referendum on economic governance itself. And here is the final reality few are willing to state openly. There is a point at which Washington will be forced to act not because markets demand it, but because voters do. When that moment arrives, the decision will not be framed as trade reform. It will be framed as damage control. And there is one final trigger that could bring that moment forward abruptly. A single disclosure tied to employment forecasts and credit exposure that has not yet reached the public domain. What we are witnessing is not a temporary market imbalance. It is a structural reckoning. Canada did not challenge the United States with confrontation or rhetoric. It challenged the system with outcomes. Lower prices, faster adoption, incoming capital, predictable rules. In doing so, it exposed a fundamental truth that Washington has struggled to confront. Protection does not equal resilience when it distorts incentives and delays adaptation. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Vehicle prices in the United States remain elevated while household auto debt sits above $1.7 trillion. Dealer inventory and financing exposure approach $1 trillion when combined. Auto lending losses in severe stress scenarios exceed $100 billion. Potential job displacement tied to prolonged demand weakness runs into the hundreds of thousands. These are not abstract risks. They are pressures already forming beneath the surface. Canada, meanwhile, has repositioned itself as a gateway. By pairing market access with domestic investment requirements, it is attracting production, technology, and long-term commitments measured in decades. Supply chains respond to incentives, not slogans. Once they move, they do not return easily. The result is a quiet rebalancing of power inside North America, one that shifts leverage away from Washington without a single treaty being rewritten. This leaves the United States facing a narrowing set of options: maintain tariffs and absorb rising consumer anger, credit strain, and political backlash. Or adjust policy and risk, admitting that the old strategy failed to deliver what it promised. Neither path is painless. Both carry consequences that extend far beyond the auto sector into employment, fiscal stability, and global credibility. History shows that economic leadership is rarely lost in one dramatic moment. It erodes through hesitation, through the refusal to recalibrate when evidence demands it. That erosion is now visible. Investors are recalculating. Manufacturers are reallocating. Voters are comparing outcomes. And there is one final development that will determine how fast this reckoning arrives. A set of internal employment and credit exposure projections tied to the auto sector that, once disclosed, could force immediate policy action under public pressure. Those projections exist. They are being discussed. They have not yet been released. When they are, the debate will no longer be about trade theory or national security framing. It will be about accountability, affordability, and the cost of delay. The question facing the United States is no longer whether the system can be defended. It is whether it can still be changed in time. And when that answer becomes clear, the outcome will reshape North American economic leadership for a generation. Is this a bold strategy or a slow-motion strategic mistake for the United States? Thanks for watching.